There was a time when sugar was a luxury few could afford, when sweetness on the tongue was a rare and precious gift. But there was something else, something dark, thick, and rich, that filled the gap between poverty and comfort. Molasses, that slow-pouring amber-black syrup, wasn't just an ingredient. It was survival wrapped in sweetness, hope baked into bread, and the quiet dignity of making do with what you had. Imagine stepping into a kitchen where the air is heavy with the smell of molasses bread baking, deep, earthy, almost smoky, with hints of iron and warmth. That smell meant more than breakfast. It meant another day fed, another winter survived, another reason to keep going. This isn't a story about fancy desserts or elaborate recipes. This is about the bread that kept families alive when money ran out, when crops failed, when the world felt too heavy to bear. Molasses bread was the taste of resilience. It was what mothers baked when there was no sugar, no honey, no butter, just flour, water, a handful of grain, and that dark syrup sitting in the pantry like liquid gold. And somehow, from almost nothing, they created something that satisfied not just hunger, but the soul. The bread was dense, dark, slightly sweet with a hint of bitterness that reminded you life was uneasy, but it was still worth living. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just culinary history, it's memory. It's the story of how our ancestors turned scarcity into nourishment, how they found sweetness in the darkest times, and how a simple loaf of bread became a symbol of endurance. If you've ever tasted molasses, you know it doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend to be refined sugar or delicate honey. It's bold, unapologetic, and carries the weight of everything it came from the sugarcane fields. The brutal labor, the long journey from plantation to table, and yet, in the hands of a determined woman standing over a wood stove, it became something beautiful. This is the story of molasses bread, the sweet taste of survival. The bread that didn't need perfection, only purpose. The bread that said, we may not have much, but we have enough. And in those words, baked into every dark, hearty slice, was a kind of wealth no amount of money could buy. If this opening stirs something in you, a memory, a longing, a recognition of what it means to make something from almost nothing, then stay. Let this story feed you the way that bread fed generations. And when it's over, share your own memory in the comments. Because every story of survival, every recipe passed down, every loaf baked in hard times, those are the flames that keep the past alive. So take a breath, settle in, and let me take you back to the kitchens where molasses bread rose slowly in the warmth of a wood stove, filling homes with the scent of survival and the promise that tomorrow there would be bread again. In the 1800s and early 1900s, sugar was expensive, sometimes impossibly so. For rural families, frontier settlers, and working-class households, refined white sugar was a luxury reserved for special occasions, if it appeared at all. A 5-pound bag of sugar could cost a day's wages or more. So what did people do when they needed sweetness? They turned to molasses, not because it was trendy or exotic, but because it was affordable, accessible, and it worked. Molasses was the byproduct of sugar refining, the thick, dark syrup left behind after sugar crystals were extracted from sugarcane juice. What the wealthy discarded, the working class transformed into sustenance. Molasses wasn't just cheaper than sugar, it was also more nutritious. It contained iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium, minerals that bodies, working long hours in fields, factories, and homesteads desperately needed. A spoonful of molasses wasn't just sweet, it was medicinal, restorative, strengthening. Mothers gave it to children who looked pale and tired. Farmers took a spoonful before heading out to work at dawn. It wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. And when baked into bread, it stretched the value of flour, added moisture and density, and turned a simple loaf into something that could stick to your ribs and carry you through a hard day. There were different kinds of molasses, each with its own character. Light molasses, taken from the first boiling, was the sweetest and mildest, closest to sugar in flavor but still distinct. Dark molasses, from the second boiling, was richer, more robust, with deeper flavors of caramel and a hint of bitterness. And then there was blackstrap molasses, the final extraction, so dark it was almost black, so thick it barely poured, with a strong, almost metallic taste. Blackstrap wasn't for everyone, but it was the most nutritious, packed with iron and minerals. It was the molasses of last resort, the molasses of survival, the molasses that said, "We're not giving up." Molasses came in different forms depending on where you lived. In the South, sorghum molasses was common, made from sorghum cane rather than sugar cane. It had a lighter, slightly tangy flavor. In New England and the mid-Atlantic, imported molasses from the Caribbean arrived in barrels at port towns and made its way inland by wagon and train. Families bought it by the gallon, storing it in crocks and jars in the pantry, rationing it carefully through the long winter months. Every drop mattered. Every spoonful was measured with intention. Nothing was wasted. And so molasses became more than just a sweetener, became a symbol of making do, of resilience, of refusing to let poverty dictate the quality of your table. It became the foundation of countless recipes: molasses cookies, molasses pie, baked beans sweetened with molasses, and above all, molasses bread. That bread, dark and hearty, was the backbone of many meals, toasted and spread with a little butter if you had it, or eaten plain if you didn't, dipped in milk for breakfast, packed in a lunch pail, served alongside stew for supper. It was versatile, filling, and forgiving, a bread that didn't demand perfection, only care. If you've ever felt the weight of not having enough, if you've ever stood in a kitchen and wondered how to make a meal out of what little you have, then you understand the importance of molasses. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't delicate, but it was real. And in its thick, dark sweetness was a kind of honesty that refined sugar could never offer. If this resonates with you, leave a comment below. Tell us, what ingredient in your kitchen carries the memory of making do? What flavor reminds you that survival is its own kind of sweetness? Making molasses bread wasn't complicated, but it required patience, something people had more of back then. Because there was no rushing a wood stove or hurrying dough that needed time to rise. The recipe varied from household to household, region to region, but the essentials remained the same: flour, molasses, water or milk, a bit of fat if you had it, leavening, and sometimes a handful of cornmeal or rye to stretch the flour further. Some families added spices: cinnamon, ginger, cloves if they had them. Others kept it plain. Either way, the result was a dense, dark loaf with a slightly sweet flavor and a texture that could hold up to the hardest butter knife or the hungriest appetite. The process began with mixing. In a large wooden bowl or earthenware crock, flour was measured often by feel rather than precise cups. Too much precision was a luxury. Then came the molasses, thick and slow, clinging to the spoon as it was scraped into the bowl. The darker the molasses, the stronger the flavor, and the more the bread would carry that characteristic bittersweet depth. Water or milk was added next, along with a pinch of salt, maybe a spoonful of lard or butter if the family could spare it. The fat wasn't just for flavor, it added moisture and helped the bread stay fresh longer, which mattered when you baked only once or twice a week. Leavening was the wild card. In earlier times, before commercial baking powder and yeast were widely available, bread was often unleavened or leavened with natural starters, saleratus, an early form of baking soda, or potash. By the late 1800s, baking soda became more common, and when combined with the acidity of molasses, it created a gentle rise. The bread wouldn't be fluffy like white bread. It was meant to be dense, substantial, something you could chew and feel satisfied by. Some recipes called for a little vinegar or buttermilk to help activate the soda. Others relied solely on the molasses itself. Once the ingredients were mixed into a thick, sticky dough, it was turned out onto a floured surface, often a worn wooden table scarred by years of kneading, and worked just enough to bring it together. Over-kneading would make it tough, and toughness wasn't the goal. The dough was then shaped into a round or oblong loaf, sometimes scored with a knife to help it expand as it baked, and placed in a greased pan or directly on the floor of a brick oven or cast iron Dutch oven. If you were lucky enough to have a wood-cook stove with an oven, you'd slide the pan in and adjust the dampers to control the heat. If not, you'd nestle the Dutch oven into the coals of the fireplace, piling embers on the lid to create an even heat from all sides. Baking took time, anywhere from 45 minutes to over an hour, depending on the heat and the size of the loaf. The smell that filled the kitchen was unmistakable. Rich, earthy, slightly smoky, with that deep sweetness that made your mouth water even if you'd already eaten. Children would hover near the stove, drawn by the scent, waiting impatiently for the moment the bread could be sliced. Mothers would test it by tapping the bottom of the loaf. If it sounded hollow, it was done. If not, back in it went. There was no timer, no digital display, just experience, intuition, and the knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation. When the bread finally emerged, dark and crusty, it was set on a rack, to cool though often it didn't get the chance. A warm slice of molasses bread, still steaming, spread with a thin scrape of butter or eaten plain, was one of the great pleasures of a hard life. It was filling, satisfying, and carried with it the knowledge that even when times were tough, there was still this bread, this warmth, this small victory over hunger. If you've ever baked bread from scratch, you know the pride that comes with it. Now imagine baking it when flour was scarce and every ingredient was precious. That's the weight molasses bread carried. That's the hope it held. Molasses bread wasn't just food, it was identity. It was the taste of home, the smell of safety, the feeling of being cared for even when resources were thin. For children growing up in those hard years, the memory of molasses bread stayed with them for life. Decades later, long after they'd moved to cities, long after white bread became cheap and abundant, they'd still remember the dark, dense slices their mothers cut, the way it tasted toasted over the stove, the way it filled their bellies and gave them strength for the day ahead. Food memory is powerful like that. It doesn't fade. It lives in the body, in the senses, in the heart. For mothers and grandmothers, baking molasses bread was an act of love and defiance. It was saying, I will feed my family, no matter what. It was taking the cheapest ingredient available and turning it into something nourishing, something that would keep their children strong and their husbands able to work. There was pride in that. There was dignity. Even when the pantry was nearly bare, even when the future felt uncertain, there was this: flour, molasses, fire, and will. And from that, life continued. Meals were served. Mornings began. Hope persisted. The bread also carried stories. Every family had their own version, their own tweaks and traditions. Some added raisins if they could get them, or chopped nuts from a tree in the yard. Some stirred in a handful of oats, or a spoonful of sorghum alongside the molasses. Some baked it in round loaves, others in rectangular pans. Some served it with beans, others with soup or stew. But no matter the variation, the essence remained the same. This was bread born of necessity, shaped by scarcity, and made sacred by the hands that created it. It was bread that didn't apologize for what it wasn't. It simply was, and that was enough. There were rituals around the bread too. In some households, the first slice was always given to the father, the breadwinner, the one whose labor kept the family afloat. In others, it went to the youngest child, or was saved for breakfast the next morning. Leftover bread was never thrown away. It was toasted, soaked in milk, crumbled into pudding, or turned into breadcrumbs for coating and stretching other meals. Waste was unthinkable. Every crumb had value. Every piece of bread represented hours of work, careful planning, and the refusal to give in to despair. And then there were the moments, small, quiet, but powerful, when molasses bread became more than sustenance. The slice handed to a neighbor who was struggling even more than you were. The loaf baked and brought to a family grieving a loss. The bread shared at church gatherings, community meals, barn raisings. In those moments, molasses bread became communion. It became connection. It became the physical manifestation of the belief that we take care of each other, that we share what little we have, that none of us survives alone. That's the deepest story of molasses bread. Not just survival, but solidarity. Not just endurance, but compassion. If you have a memory of molasses bread, or a food that carried your family through hard times, share it in the comments. Let's honor those kitchens, those hands, those loaves that fed not just bodies but souls. Because every memory we speak aloud, every recipe we pass on, every story we tell, that's how we keep the past alive. That's how we honor the ones who came before. That's how we remember what really matters. As the 20th century progressed, molasses bread slowly began to disappear from American tables. It wasn't a sudden death, but a gradual fading, like a song that stops being sung, a recipe that stops being written down, a flavor that becomes unfamiliar to younger generations. The reasons were many, but they all pointed in the same direction: abundance. As the country industrialized, as wages rose, as food production became mechanized and transportation improved, things that had once been luxuries became commonplace. Sugar, once prohibitively expensive, became cheap and ubiquitous. White flour became refined, soft, and widely available. Commercial bakeries began producing soft, white sandwich bread that was convenient, uniform, and required no effort to make. For families who had spent decades stretching every penny, this abundance was both a blessing and a forgetting. Why make molasses bread when you could buy soft white bread at the store for pennies? Why measure and mix and wait when you could simply open a package? The convenience was undeniable, and for people who had worked so hard for so long, the ease was seductive. But something was lost in the trade. The connection to the process, the knowledge of how to make do, the taste of something real, something dense and earthy and honest. White bread was soft and sweet and required no chewing, no thought, no memory. It was food without story, sustenance without soul. Molasses itself also fell out of favor. As sugar became cheap, molasses seemed old-fashioned, heavy, too strong in flavor. It reminded people of hard times they wanted to forget. The younger generation, growing up in post-World War II prosperity, didn't want reminders of scarcity. They wanted bright, shiny, new white. They wanted processed cheese and canned vegetables, and bread so white and soft it could be squeezed into a ball. The foods of survival became embarrassing, something to leave behind, something that marked you as poor, rural, backward, and so molasses bread faded. Recipes were tucked away in old cookbooks, passed over in favor of newer, trendier bakes. The knowledge slowly died with the grandmothers who had made it. But here's the paradox. In losing molasses bread, we also lost something essential about ourselves. We lost the wisdom of making do. We lost the pride of creating something nourishing from almost nothing. We lost the taste of resilience. And now, decades later, in a world drowning in processed food, sugar crashes, and disconnection from where our food comes from, people are beginning to remember. Artisan bakeries are baking dense, whole grain breads again. Home bakers are rediscovering old recipes. Molasses is making a quiet comeback, not as a symbol of poverty, but as a symbol of authenticity, of wholeness, of choosing quality over convenience. There's a hunger now, not just for food, but for meaning, for food that has a story, for recipes that carry memory, for flavors that don't lie or pretend. Molasses bread is one of those flavors. It doesn't try to be something it's not. It doesn't apologize for its darkness, its density, its bittersweet edge. It simply offers what it has always offered: nourishment, endurance, and the quiet assurance that even when times are hard, there is still sweetness to be found if you know where to look and how to work for it. If you're feeling the weight of a world that's too fast, too shallow, too disconnected, maybe what you need isn't more convenience. Maybe what you need is a loaf of bread that takes time, that requires your hands, that connects you to generations of people who knew what it meant to feed their families with care and intention. Maybe what you need is to remember that survival isn't just about getting through, it's about finding sweetness, even in the dark. If this resonates, let us know. Write one word in the comments that describes what you're hungry for, because hunger isn't always about food. Sometimes it's about meaning, and meaning, like molasses bread, takes time to rise. Close your eyes, can you smell it? The deep, rich, almost smoky scent of molasses bread baking in a cast-iron oven. Can you feel the weight of the loaf in your hands, dense, substantial, honest? Can you taste it, that bittersweet edge, the hint of iron, the warmth that spreads through your chest as you chew? That's not just imagination. That's memory, ancient and collective, living in your blood even if you've never tasted molasses bread in your life. Because some knowledge isn't learned, it's inherited. And the knowledge of survival, of making do, of finding sweetness in scarcity, that's in all of us, waiting to be remembered. Molasses bread taught our ancestors that survival is sweet, but not in the way we think. It's not the easy sweetness of candy or cake. It's the hard-won sweetness of endurance, the satisfaction of creating something from almost nothing, the pride of feeding your family when the world says you have no right to. It's the sweetness of knowing you didn't give up, that even when the pantry was bare, you still found a way, that even when the future felt uncertain, you still baked bread for tomorrow. That's the kind of sweetness that lasts. That's the kind of sweetness that molasses bread held in every dark, hearty slice. Today, we live in a world where everything is easy and nothing is enough. We have more food than ever, yet we are starving for meaning, for connection, for the sense that what we eat and how we live actually matters. We've traded the wisdom of scarcity for the emptiness of abundance. We've forgotten that some of the most important things in life, love, resilience, community, are only learned when resources are limited and choices are hard. Molasses bread knew that. The people who baked it knew that. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we remember it too. So tonight, if you're feeling restless, If the world feels too loud and too empty at the same time, try this. Find a recipe for molasses bread. Don't use a bread machine. Don't rush it. Mix it by hand. Feel the dough. Smell the molasses. Let it rise slowly. Bake it in a real oven. And as it bakes, let the scent fill your home. And when it's done, cut a thick slice, still warm, and eat it slowly. Taste the history. Taste the survival. Taste the sweetness that comes not from sugar, but from the refusal to give up. That's what molasses bread offers. That's what it's always offered. And that's what we need now, more than ever. If this story touched something in you, share it. Share it with someone who's struggling, someone who feels like they're running on empty, someone who needs to be reminded that survival isn't just about getting through. It's about finding the sweetness, even in the dark. Tell us in the comments, what's your survival food? What recipe, what flavor, what meal reminds you that you're stronger than you think? Because every story we share is a slice of bread passed hand to hand. Every memory we speak is a loaf baked for the next generation. And together, we make sure the bread never runs out. This was another episode of Ancient Memories of America. From the series Forgotten Foods, where every recipe is a memory, and every memory is a taste of survival, resilience, and the sweetness that endures, keeping the flavors of the past alive. Until the next meal.